A single mom caught me staring while sunbathing. Can you help me with my back? Can you help me with my back? She said it to the sky. Not to me. Not to anyone in particular. She said it the way you say something when you've been alone long enough that the habit of asking out loud has replaced the habit of asking anyone specifically, directed at the general universe. Take it or leave it. I was standing at the edge of my back porch, watering a plant I kept forgetting to water, pretending the reason I was suddenly very interested in the far corner of my yard had nothing to do with the woman lying on a towel on the other side of the low fence that separated our properties. She had been there for 20 minutes. I had been watering the same plant for 6. I set down the watering can. "I can help," I said, like a person who had any idea what he was doing. She turned her head and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who did not expect an answer and is now recalibrating. She had sunglasses on, so I got the glasses version of the look, which was somehow more legible than the eyes would have been. The corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile and not quite a verdict. "There's lotion on the table," she said, "if you don't mind." Her name was Nina. We had lived next door to each other for 7 months and had spoken maybe 9 times, almost all of which were logistical. A noise complaint I was relaying, a package left at my door, a conversation about the tree on the property line whose roots had opinions about her driveway. I knew she had a daughter. I knew the daughter was 6 because she had asked me once, with great directness, why I didn't have any toys in my yard, and when I said I didn't have any kids she'd said "oh," and looked briefly at me with an expression of profound pity before running back inside. I knew Nina's car left at 7:15 every morning and came back at 6:45, sometimes 6, occasionally after 8, depending on what the day had decided to be. I knew she ordered pizza on Fridays. I knew the light in her kitchen was on most nights until 10 or 10:30. What I did not know, what was about to become the organizing fact of the next several months of my life, was that Nina was carrying something very heavy, very quietly, and had been for longer than anyone standing outside of it could guess. I climbed over the low fence because the gate was on the other side, and this was faster, and she watched me do it without comment. I sat down beside her on the edge of the grass, and she handed me the lotion without looking, and I applied it with the focused attention of a man who had made a decision and was committed to not overthinking it. "You've been watering that plant for a long time," she said. "It's been dry," I said. "It's a cactus," she said. I said nothing. She said nothing. The afternoon light came through the elm tree in long slanted pieces, and the 6-year-old Rosie was inside the house, making the specific kind of sound that means content and occupied, and not requiring intervention. "She knows you're out here," Nina said. "She'll appear in approximately 4 minutes. Is that a problem?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "She likes you. She said you have kind eyes. She's been wrong about people before, but she has a good record." I handed the lotion back. "How's her record?" "Better than mine," Nina said, and said it plainly, without self-pity, the way you state something that is simply true. She put the lotion on the table. She sat up and looked at the yard, her yard. The small specific world she'd made for herself in it, the raised bed with tomatoes that were almost ready, the chalk hopscotch grid Rosie had drawn on the patio, the wind-up solar lights she'd planted along the path. All of it assembled with the care of someone who'd had to start something from scratch and had done it deliberately. Rosie appeared in the back doorway in exactly 4 minutes. She assessed the situation, decided it was acceptable, and came outside carrying a stuffed rabbit and a very serious expression. "You came over the fence," she said to me. "The gate was far," I said. She considered this. "That's not a good reason," she said, and sat down beside her mother. Nina looked at me over Rosie's head with the expression of a woman who had been informed of this fact by this particular person many times and was in full agreement. I stayed for an hour. We sat in the yard and Rosie showed me the tomato plants and explained at length which ones were doing well and which ones she was worried about, with the gravity of a person managing a significant agricultural concern. Nina made lemonade, and we drank it in the slow afternoon, and it was one of those hours that doesn't feel like it's doing anything while it's happening, but that you can feel, even in it, settling into the record of things that will matter. When I climbed back over the fence at 6 o'clock, Rosie called after me. "You can use the gate next time." "Deal," I said. I went inside and stood in my kitchen for a while. I was aware that something had shifted in the weight of my evening, the specific gravity of it, and I didn't want to examine it too closely because I'd had a habit, over the previous few years, of examining things until they collapsed. I just let it be what it was. I used the gate the next time, and the time after that. The rhythm that developed had no announcement and no formal shape. It was built from small things: a coffee brought over on a Saturday morning without being asked, a conversation over the fence while Rosie did elaborate things with chalk, an evening where I appeared at the gate with takeout because I'd ordered too much and said so, which was partly true. Nina received all of it with the specific wariness of someone who has learned to be careful about what she lets mean something, and I didn't push. Because you don't push that. You just show up, and you let the showing up be its own argument. What I was learning about Nina came in pieces. She'd been married for 4 years. Rosie's father was not a villain in the story, she was careful to say, not the version she would ever tell Rosie anyway, and not even the version she told herself now, 2 years out. He had been someone who wanted things Nina couldn't give him, and she'd been someone who wanted things he couldn't give her, and they had tried for longer than was kind to either of them to pretend otherwise. He was in the picture, saw Rosie on alternating weekends, sent child support without drama, was decent in the specific way of someone managing their own guilt. It was not a horror story. It was just the quieter, more exhausting kind of ending. The kind where no one is clearly wrong, and you're both just left holding the pieces of something that almost worked. She'd moved here 14 months ago. Found the house with the yard for Rosie's sake. Found the job. She did contract accounting work. 3 clients. Mostly remote, flexible by design, because the school pickup and the sick days and the unpredictable machinery of a small child's life had to be accommodated. She'd built all of it with the focus of someone who had decided that falling apart was not a thing she had time for, and had enforced that decision so thoroughly that she'd also accidentally ruled out most of the other things: the dinners, the evenings, the slow unclenching of spending time with someone who wasn't a client or a 6-year-old. She told me this, not all at once, over weeks of mornings and one longer evening when Rosie was at her father's, and Nina said yes to the dinner I'd been building toward asking about for 2 weeks. And we sat in a restaurant that was not too formal and not too casual, and talked the way people talk when they've been talking over a fence for 2 months and are finally in the same plane. She told me about the marriage and the ending of it with the equanimity of someone who had processed it thoroughly, and then she said something that I kept. "I know how to be alone," she said. "I got very good at it. What I can't always figure out is whether that's a skill or a wall." I thought about that for the rest of the dinner. I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about it on my side of the fence, in my kitchen, in the specific quality of my own silence. I think I told her the next morning, over coffee on her porch, that it's probably both. She looked at me. "What made you think about it overnight?" "Because I recognized it," I said. She was quiet. "Yeah," she said, after a while. "I thought maybe you had." What happened next is not the part that looks like a story. There was no single scene, no event with clean edges. What happened was slower than that and harder to explain, which is the way the real things tend to go. Rosie decided she approved of me. This happened in stages. First, she allowed me to sit with them at dinner without demanding I explain myself. Then, she showed me her drawings, which were extensive and thematically focused on horses and one specific dinosaur she called Gerald. Then she asked, one Saturday with the directness she'd inherited from her mother, whether I was going to be around for a long time, and I said I hoped so. And she said okay and went back to Gerald. Nina, who was standing in the kitchen doorway and had heard all of this, looked at me with an expression I was becoming familiar with, the one that was warm and careful at the same time, the one that said, I see this. I don't know what to do with it yet. I'm letting it be here. There was the evening Nina's biggest client called at 7:30 with a problem in a spreadsheet that needed resolution before a board meeting at 9 the next morning. Rosie was in bed. Nina was at her kitchen table with the laptop open and the phone against her shoulder, and I'd come over to return a container, and I read the room and said nothing, and sat down and started working through the file she pointed me at. I'm not an accountant, but I can find a logic error, and I have the patience for it. And we worked in parallel until 10:30 when the fix was found, and her client called back and said thank you and hung up. She sat back and closed the laptop and looked at the ceiling. I should have caught that myself, she said. You've been working since 7 a.m., I said. You caught it at 10:30 with help. That's still caught. She looked at me. Why are you here? She said. Not unkindly. Genuinely, like a person who keeps finding the same thing in her house and wants to understand the mechanism. You needed someone to sit down, I said. So I sat down. She said nothing for a moment. Then that's a very small answer. It's the right-sized answer for 10:30, I said. She almost laughed. Almost something in her face softened that had been held for hours. Then the thing happened, the thing that is not small. I found out on a Tuesday morning. I didn't find out from Nina. I found out because I ran into her sister Petra at the hardware store. Nina had mentioned Petra a few times, older by 4 years, lived 40 minutes north, reliable in the way of people who show up when it matters. Petra recognized me from a photo, which was information I stored without comment. She said she was glad to meet me. She said Nina had been going through something, and she was glad Nina had a neighbor she trusted. I said, what do you mean, going through something? Petra said she assumed Nina had told me. Then she saw my face and said she'd probably said too much and changed the subject. I drove home. I knocked on Nina's door at 10 that morning instead of waiting for the afternoon. She answered in her work clothes, laptop under her arm, phone in hand. She saw my face. She let me in. What did Petra say? She said. That you were going through something, I said. And that she assumed you'd told me. Nina set the laptop on the counter. She looked at the window for a moment. Then, she sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from her, and she told me. The accounting firm she'd done the most stable work for, 18 months, her most consistent client, the one that formed the backbone of what she'd built, had been going through a restructuring. The partner she worked with directly had assured her through the process that her contract would roll over. Last week, without the conversation she'd been promised, the contract had been terminated by email. No severance. No transition. The email arrived on a Thursday, and she had not told anyone because Rosie had a school presentation that Friday, and she needed to be present for it. And then she needed to figure out what to do before she said anything to anyone. She'd been carrying it for 5 days. The other 2 clients, I said. Cover about 40% of what the third one did, she said. Okay, I said. And the timeline, how long before it's a real problem? She looked at me. This was, I understood, not the response she expected. Had been dreading. Something softer. Something that would require her to manage someone else's reaction to her crisis while she was in the middle of it. Instead, I was asking for the operational timeline. 6 weeks comfortable, she said. 10 weeks if I cut everything that isn't rosy. Then we have 6 weeks comfortable, I said. What do you have in the pipeline? She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the specific thing that happens when someone stops waiting for a conversation to go badly. She opened the laptop. We went through it together. She had 2 warm leads she hadn't followed up on because she'd been relying on the contract. She had a professional network she'd been under-leveraging because the stable client hadn't required her to maintain it. She had a reputation in a niche sector, healthcare-adjacent compliance accounting, that was specific enough to be findable by the right people and broad enough to extend into adjacent work. We spent 2 hours building a contact list and drafting outreach, not desperate outreach, targeted, specific, the kind that leads with value and asks a precise question. She knew how to write it. She just needed someone in the room while she did. By noon, she had sent 6 emails. By Thursday, she had 3 responses. By the following Wednesday, she had a call scheduled with a contact who'd referred her to a mid-size healthcare firm looking for exactly her profile on a part-time contract basis, not the volume of the lost client, but stable. And the beginning of something. She told me about the call on Wednesday evening, on her porch, with Rosie inside, in the tone of someone who has been holding their breath for 2 weeks and has just exhaled. You didn't panic, she said. Panicking wouldn't have helped, I said. Most people panic, she said. Or they try to fix it in ways that aren't useful. You just sat down. It's the right-sized answer, I said. It was the same thing I'd said at 10:30 on the night of the spreadsheet, and she recognized it, and something in her expression moved. She was quiet for a moment. Rosie's voice came through the window. She was conducting some kind of monologue directed at Gerald. The solar lights along the porch path came on one at a time as the light went. I don't know how to do this, Nina said. Not specifically. Generally, the whole of it. I know, I said. I don't either. I've been out of practice for a long time. She looked at me. What are you out of practice at, specifically? Letting something matter, I said. Doing it anyway, not examining it until it collapses. She was quiet. The solar lights finished coming on. The evening settled around us. Rosie asked me this morning, she said slowly, if you would be here for her birthday. When is it? 3 weeks. Then yes, I said. I'll be here. She looked at me for a long time, with the careful and warm expression that I had learned by then was how Nina looked at things she was allowing herself to want. She's going to ask you to make the cake, she said. She does this to people she's decided to keep. She gives them a task. What kind of cake? I said. She'll tell you it's complicated, Nina said. It isn't. She just wants the process. Then I'll show up for the process, I said. Nina looked away at the yard, at the tomatoes which had come in, which Rosie had declared a victory and documented with photographs, at the hopscotch grid, which had been repainted twice, at the small lit path. All the things she'd built carefully from a place of nothing, with her daughter beside her, in a life that had required her to be very good at alone. I think, she said, to the yard more than to me, that it might be okay to let someone else be in the picture. I said nothing. Because it wasn't a question. and it didn't need an answer. And sometimes the most useful thing is to just stay still and let someone finish the thought they've been working toward for a long time. Rosie's birthday was a Saturday in October. The cake was chocolate with a horse on it, not a complicated design as promised, just a horse drawn in icing that Rosie directed with the authority of an art director and the patience of exactly 0. I made it 3 days in advance for practice, and once more on Friday night, with Rosie on a stool beside me at the counter, issuing corrections, and Nina at the kitchen table with a glass of wine pretending to read something and watching the two of us with an expression she didn't know she was wearing. The party was 8 6-year-olds in the backyard. It was, by any measure, a significant operational event. I set up the tables. I managed the chaos of 8 small people with the focused calm of a man who has decided that wherever he is here. Nina moved through it with the specific ease of a person in full command of her own territory, and somewhere in the middle of it she caught my eye across the yard, across the noise and the streamers and the 8 6-year-olds and Gerald the dinosaur, who had been given a place of honor on the gift table, and just looked at me for a second with something simple and certain. I looked back. Rosie, when the cake came out, announced to the assembled 6-year-olds that I had made it, and that it had taken 3 tries, and that this was because good things take practice. She said this with the tone of someone sharing a life lesson. One of the other children looked confused. Rosie moved on. After the guests left, after the cleanup, after Rosie had been put to bed in full birthday exhaustion with Gerald and the specific contentment of someone who has had an excellent day, Nina and I sat on the porch in the quiet with what was left of the wine and the October evening and the solar lights doing their slow coming on. She didn't say anything for a while. I didn't either. There was nothing that needed to be said. There was just this: the porch, the lights, the quiet house with a sleeping child, the small lit yard she'd built from nothing. She reached over without looking and put her hand over mine. Just for a moment. Just the weight of it. "I practiced," she said. I turned my hand over. "I know," I said. If you've ever been the person who stays, who sits down when someone's in crisis, who shows up at the gate, who makes the cake 3 times, because good things take practice. Have you ever realized that the life you were quietly building beside someone was already the thing you'd been looking for? Tell me about the person you stayed for. Tell me what the first small thing was that told you it was worth it. I want to read every one of those comments. And if this story reached you at the right moment, subscribe. There's more of this waiting, and it was made for you. What I haven't told you is the part that didn't have events. The part that was just time. Just the accumulation of ordinary days that do the actual work that the dramatic moments get the credit for. Because that is how this kind of thing is really built. Not in the pool moment or the crisis call or the birthday cake. In the unremarkable Tuesday mornings that teach you who a person is when nothing is happening. There was the morning Nina's car wouldn't start. 7:15 and Rosie needed to be at school, and the client call was at 8 and the car was making a sound that meant no. I heard it from my kitchen because the windows were open. I came outside with my keys and said I'll drive, and Nina said you don't have to, and I said I know, let's go, and we got Rosie to school with 6 minutes to spare. I dropped Nina back at her house, and she got on her call, and I went to work, and that was all of it. But the next morning there was coffee left on my porch, in a container with a note that just said thank you, and a drawing of a cactus from Rosie, with a small face on it. I still have that drawing. There was the evening Nina knocked on my door at 9 p.m. and said she was sorry to bother me, and I said stop, come in. And she sat at my kitchen table and said she'd had a conversation with Rosie's teacher that afternoon, that had left her feeling like she was failing at something, and she needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell her she was doing fine. So I didn't tell her she was doing fine. I asked her what the teacher had said, and then I asked what she thought about it, and then I listened for the whole of it without rushing her to the conclusion. By 10 o'clock, she'd talked herself to the other side of it. Not because I'd said anything particularly useful, but because she'd had the room to go the whole distance. She went home and texted me 20 minutes later, "Thank you for not fixing it." That was exactly right. I kept that too. There was the specific Saturday in September where nothing happened at all. Rosie was at her father's. Nina had no calls, no deadlines, no tasks. She knocked on my fence gate in the morning and said she had no idea what to do with a full empty day, and I said I know exactly what to do with that. And we drove 40 minutes to a state park and walked for 3 hours through the kind of trees that make September worth the summer, and ate sandwiches on a rock overlooking a small, unremarkable lake, and talked about everything and nothing in the way that only happens when there is no agenda and no clock. She told me about the town she grew up in. I told her about the year I spent in a job that required me to be a fundamentally different person, and how long it took me to recover from pretending. She told me about the moment she realized her marriage was over, which was not a dramatic moment, but a quiet Tuesday morning when she looked at her husband across the breakfast table and felt something simply end, like a light going off, and knew with complete clarity that what she was feeling was not anger or hurt or anything actionable, but just the specific sadness of a thing that had been true that was now not true. "How long did it take," I said, "before the quiet didn't feel like loss?" She thought about it. "About 14 months, she said. And then one morning I woke up and the quiet felt like mine." I understood that completely. I told her so. She looked at me sideways on the rock. "You had a long quiet too." 3 years, I said. After my own version of a thing that almost worked. "What happened?" "She needed someone who was already the person he was going to be," I said. I was still becoming it. The timing wasn't ours. Nina was quiet for a moment. The lake did its small, indifferent thing below us. "And now?" she said. "Now I'm more the person," I said. "Or closer to it." She said nothing, but she stayed on the rock for another hour, and the silence had a different quality after that. Denser, warmer. The kind that holds something, rather than the kind that waits. On the drive back, she fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window. I drove carefully. I thought about the 14 months of her quiet, becoming hers. I thought about the 3 years of mine. I thought about the cactus drawing on my refrigerator and the thank you for not fixing it, and the way she looked at the yard she'd built, and the way Rosie had declared the tomatoes a victory. I thought about what it means to build something from nothing. How specific the materials are. How personal the architecture. I want to tell you about the week before the birthday, because that week matters, and I almost skipped it. Rosie's father called on a Monday to say he needed to move his October weekend. A work conflict. Unavoidable. Very sorry. Which meant Rosie would not be at her father's that weekend, which meant the logistics of the birthday party changed, and which also meant that Nina, who had been managing Rosie's navigation of the alternating weekends with careful patience, now had to have the conversation with a 6-year-old about why Daddy wasn't coming when she expected him. She had that conversation. Rosie cried, not devastatingly, but genuinely, the way children cry when they understand something isn't fair and can't be fixed. Nina held her and said the right things and did not say any of the wrong things, which takes more discipline than people who haven't done it understand. After Rosie was settled, Nina came and sat on my porch and was very quiet for a long time. "He's not a bad person," she said. He just makes choices that prioritize himself and then apologizes for them afterward. And I don't know how to make Rosie understand that without making her love him less, and I don't want her to love him less. I said nothing. I don't know how to teach her, Nina said. That you can love someone and also see them clearly. That those two things aren't opposites. She looked at the yard. I'm still learning it myself. You're teaching it by doing it, I said. She watches you. She sees you clearly, and you still take care of her. Nina looked at me. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one, I said. I've been watching. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked away at the lights coming on. You watch carefully, she said. I try to, I said. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. Rosie told me last week, she said, that you have kind eyes and that she was right the first time. She mentioned she'd made that assessment, I said, before I knew her name. She trusts her first reads, Nina said. She got that from me. It's only reliable about 70% of the time, but she's too young for me to tell her that. And your read on me? I said. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the yard for a while, the tomatoes, the path, the chalk lines of Rosie's last hopscotch grid, still faintly visible under the newer one. You show up, she said. Quietly, without announcing it or keeping track. You show up and you sit down and you stay for the whole thing. The spreadsheet and the school drop off and the fence conversation and the hard Tuesday night and the walk in the woods and the 3 practice cakes. She paused. My read is that you mean it. That you're not performing meaning it. That this is just actually who you are. I let that sit for a moment. That's the most thorough assessment I've received, I said. I told you. I watch carefully, too. After the birthday. After the 8 6-year-olds and the chocolate horse cake and the October quiet on the porch with the wine and the hand over mine, there was a morning about a week later when I came over with coffee and found Rosie at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a serious expression, clearly engaged in a project of importance. I sat down across from her. She didn't look up. I'm making a list, she said. Of what? Of things that are good, she said. My teacher said when things feel big, you should remember what's good. That's good advice, I said. I know, she said. She added something to the list. You're on it, she said. In case you wanted to know. Nina, in the kitchen making the coffee, had her back to us. But her shoulders did something very small, a shift. A release, and I saw it. I looked at the list Rosie was writing. Gerald, the tomatoes, Mom's laugh, the park with the big slide, the cake. You, thank you, I said. That means a lot to me. I know, said Rosie with absolute certainty, and kept writing. The new client contract came through 2 weeks after the birthday. Stable, part-time, healthcare compliance, exactly the niche she'd spent 18 months building expertise in. She called me when she got the email, and I was at my desk, and she said it came through, and I could hear in her voice the specific quality of someone standing on ground that recently wasn't there. You did that, I said. We sat down, she said. You sat down with me. You did the work. I said. Yes, she said. But you stayed in the room while I did it. That's not nothing. A pause. Actually, it's a lot. I'm realizing it's a lot. I thought about what she'd said on the porch, I know how to be alone. I got very good at it. And I thought about the question underneath it, the one she'd asked herself out loud on a slow afternoon, whether that was a skill or a wall. Both, I'd said. I still think both. But walls have gates. And sometimes someone finds the gate on the right day at the right hour and doesn't make a ceremony of it, just pushes it open and steps through and sits down. That is the whole of the story. The sunscreen, and the cactus, and the quiet, and the list on the kitchen table with my name on it. None of it dramatic. All of it real. All of it the specific weight of two careful people who had both gotten very good at alone, deciding, slowly, without announcements, in the accumulation of unremarkable Tuesdays, to try something different. If you've ever been the kind of person who shows up quietly, who doesn't make a performance of being there, who just sits down and stays for the whole thing, have you ever realized, much later than you expected, that the person you kept showing up for had been keeping track in ways you didn't know? Tell me about the small thing. The Tuesday thing. The thing that didn't feel like a moment but turned out to be everything. I want every single one of those stories. And if this one found you, subscribe. There are more where this came from, and they were all made for the person who stayed. There is one more thing I want to tell you, and it is the smallest thing. And it is also the most important. About 3 weeks after the contract came through, after the birthday, after the porch and the wine and the hand, we were in Nina's kitchen on an ordinary Wednesday evening, Rosie doing homework at the table, Nina reviewing something on her laptop, me fixing the cabinet hinge that had been loose for 2 months and that I'd kept meaning to get to. Nobody was talking. The news was on low somewhere in the other room, and Rosie was writing and erasing and writing, and the cabinet was giving me more trouble than it had any right to, and Nina was reading something with her chin in her hand, and the kitchen light was doing what kitchen lights do when the evening comes in, warm and low and specific. And I had the thought, not loudly, not as a revelation, just quietly, the way things arrive when you've stopped trying to make them arrive. I thought, I am home. Not my house, her house, their house, this kitchen with the loose hinge and the homework on the table and the television murmuring. This exact Wednesday, this exact light. The particular smell of the casserole she'd put in an hour ago. The specific sound of Rosie erasing something with great conviction. The warm weight of the room around me. I had not felt that in a very long time. Maybe longer than I could honestly account for. I fixed the hinge. I closed the cabinet. I turned around, and Nina was looking at me from her laptop with the careful and warm expression, and I must have had something on my face because she tilted her head slightly in the way that meant she was asking without asking. Nothing, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she went back to her screen. Rosie said, "Without looking up, you looked like you figured something out." Nina, still reading, said nothing, but her mouth did the thing, not quite a smile, not quite a verdict, that I had first seen over the top of those sunglasses on an afternoon in June. The thing I now knew meant she was thinking something she wasn't saying yet. "Maybe," I said to Rosie. "What was it?" she asked. I thought about how to answer a 6-year-old's direct question truthfully, without saying too much. "That this is a good place to be," I said. Rosie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "We think so too," she said, and went back to her homework. Nina turned a page. I stood in their kitchen in the Wednesday evening light and let it be exactly what it was, which was enough. And then, more than enough. And then something I didn't have a word for yet, but that I trusted was going to keep becoming itself the longer I stayed. I stayed. If you've ever stood in a room that wasn't technically yours and felt, for the first time in a long time, like you'd found the place you'd been looking for without knowing what to call it. Have you ever realized that home wasn't a building or an address, but a specific Wednesday in someone else's kitchen with the light coming in right? Tell me where you found yours. Tell me what the small thing was that made you know. And if this story gave you something tonight, subscribe. Every week there's another one waiting. and it was written for the person who understands that the ordinary moments are where the real things live.